Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about George Orwell's essay Politics in the English Language. Hopefully you've already read over it and taken your own notes by now, so this will be more of a summary, just outlining key points, making sure that you got a few key takeaways. But again, this is not meant to replace reading the essay, so please go back and do that if you haven't yet. So looking at an overall outline of Orwell's essay, we can break it down into the following components. He has an introduction where he talks about why the English language is in decline and what impact that has on our thoughts. He then gives 5 examples of what he refers to as this bad English. He gives reasons why these are examples of bad English, commentary on why that's a problem, as well as more analysis of the 5 examples. He goes more in depth into what makes them quote-unquote bad English in his opinion. And then he offers solutions. So both how these pieces of writing could be fixed to avoid the issues that he brings up, as well as how we can avoid these issues in our own writing. He points out 2 main issues that he says all 5 of these examples and all examples of poor English writing share. He says the first one is staleness of imagery, and the second one is lack of precision. What he says both of those have in common is that they reflect our current tendency to just take together pre-made, prefabricated sentences, phrases, strings of words that we hear all the time together and put those together in our writing rather than individually picking words that make the most sense for our meaning. And this is a theme that he comes back to often throughout his essay, this idea that we have taken the easy way out while we are writing in English and speaking in English by not necessarily putting as much mental thought anymore into what words best describe what we're trying to say, but almost like we're just taking these different pre-existing puzzle pieces and clicking them into place rather than creating our own real writing and real meaning. Within those 2 issues, he highlights a few more specific problem areas. He talks about dying metaphors, operators or verbal false limbs. If you think about a false limb, sometimes called a phantom limb, you hear about people who have undergone amputation of some sort and they can still feel the pain even though that limb or part of their body isn't there anymore. They have that phantom pain. He refers to this as a verbal false limb. So adding words or phrases that don't need to be there and still kind of echo despite their lack of any real substance or appearance. He also cites pretentious diction as an issue and meaningless words. So we're going to take a closer look at each of those, starting with dying metaphors. His main issue with that is that he says that there are certain metaphors that have lost power and are used just to save people trouble. So metaphors that aren't really vivid don't really fit maybe the situation at hand, but that we use so often in our day-to-day lives that it's just easier to use the first metaphor that comes to mind than to necessarily think of the best one to describe a situation. So he gives a lot of examples. This essay is from 1946, so some of the examples in his essay, I'd argue, have already gone away on their own. So I included 3 that I still do here from time to time, right? We have toe the line, play into the hands of, and Achilles heel. I want to be clear that throughout this video, we are talking about Orwell's opinions. I'm not necessarily saying that, you're a terrible writer if you ever use one of these metaphors. You just want to keep in mind, do you really know what it means, right? Because he brings up the idea of, do we know what it actually means to toe the line? Or are we just so used to hearing it over and over again that it's easier to put that in our writing than to think of an original way to say something? The second thing he talks about is those verbal false limbs. This is where he's saying that it's people pretty much just padding each sentence with extra syllables. This is a big issue in writing. Again, It's not to say that longer words are always worse or shorter words are always better, but you want to make sure that it's contributing to the meaning rather than just there to have extra there. So he talks about how this can come in the form of a verb phrase, right? Where maybe people are tempted to write render an operative rather than stop. He mentions that this can come in the form of a conjunction or a preposition, where you might be tempted to write with respect to rather than just say regarding. And this can also come in the form of sentence endings by tacking on extra things at the end of a sentence that, again, don't necessarily contribute directly to the meaning, but just kind of add on so that it feels like there's more there. He gives a lot of examples, one of which is greatly to be desired. With pretentious diction, he talks about just dressing up words unnecessarily. Rather than examples so much, he highlights the reasons for doing this, which I think is important to keep in mind. So why would we use pretentious diction? The first reason he gives is for the appearance of scientific impartiality. So he argues that the more pretentious or the more elevated or sophisticated sounding words that you pepper into an essay, the more you can offer it this illusion of scientific impartiality, right? People will start to kind of overlook maybe the meat or the substance of what you're presenting if it is written in such a way that convinces them that you must absolutely be right about what you're talking about. So that's one reason he says that we use it. Second reason he mentions for having this overflow of pretentious diction is what the process of international politics. So again, this idea of trying to sway one side over or maybe win over a block of voters just by dressing up your words unnecessarily. And again, his issue with this is not that people shouldn't be using nice words or be using a thesaurus. His issue is that we tend to do this at the expense of clarity rather than for its benefit. So rather than having our meaning be clearer by using these words, he argues that it's actually making our meaning harder to understand. And the third reason that he gives is for glorifying war. This will come back, this idea, in a quote that we're going to look at later in this video. But again, that idea that you can convince people that something was right or wrong based on the language that you chose. He also talks a lot about meaningless words. I think this one quote in particular really highlights his issue with what he feels are meaningless words, especially in the context of political writing. He says, "It is almost universally felt that when we call a country democratic, we are praising it. Consequently, the defenders of every kind of regime claim that it is a democracy, and fear that they might have to stop using that word if it were tied down to any one meaning." So we have a few levels to the issue of meaningless words here. In this quote, he's using the word democracy as an example of a meaningless word, right? He's saying that it's something that we just give. It's a word that we just give to any country or region where we want to praise the system of government. He says, on the other hand, any country or system he mentions later on that we think is bad, we call fascist, right? And so again, he's saying that it's not necessarily a problem to comment on government, but just that in these examples, these words have been so overused that it's not clear what they really mean anymore. And that, to him, is the biggest issue with writing. Writing should reflect what you mean, and he is really concerned that there is this tendency away from that. If it's not obvious already, he then goes into a few reasons why this is so problematic. In the essay, he mentions that the whole tendency of prose is away from concreteness, right? So it's an issue. We're getting into more and more abstract ideas, which is suitable for some topics, but definitely not for all of them. And he also says by using stale metaphors, similes, and idioms, you save much mental effort at the cost of leaving your meaning vague, not only for your reader, but for yourself. And that's a huge issue as well for us in our day-to-day lives, right? We've probably all had the experience where we get maybe a sentence or paragraph or however much into an essay we're writing, and we step back and say, what am I actually trying to say, right? We've got words on the page, but we don't really know what we're talking about. It's exactly what Orwell is warning against, right? Of making sure that you're clear on what your meaning is and then picking words to match that, rather than picking words that sound good and then later trying to make some sort of meaning out of it. And then, practically speaking, he mentions how these are big issues for us because of the use of writing and speech in politics. He says that if political writing is bad writing, right, the implication that his essay brings is, how do we move forward as a society? If writing really does impact our thoughts and we're only putting bad writing out there, how are we going to move forward if all we have is bad thoughts? And also, how do we hold our elected officials accountable to what they say? If we're so used to this system where everything is vague and unclear, how do we make it clear enough that we know what to hold our officials accountable for? And so he offers a few solutions. Key one, he says, is a scrupulous writer in every sentence that he writes will ask himself at least 4 questions. What am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? And then he mentions 2 more. Could I put it more shortly? Have I said anything that is avoidably ugly? So this is kind of his checklist for himself for what writers should keep in mind. I think it's also just great advice for us as we're writing as well, whether or not we consider our writing political. He then goes into a few more rules that he suggests. He says, never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. Never use the passive where you can use the active. So that's saying passive voice rather than active voice. So an example of that would be that I should say, I watched the video rather than the video was watched, right? I watched, that's active. The video was watched is passive. He's saying the active is better there. Most people would agree. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. And break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous, right? So these are his rules that he offers. 1 through 5, straightforward. And then on the 6th one, he does mention that if it's just getting too convoluted or complex in your writing, break one of the rules. And so the closing thought I wanted to leave you with from this essay is a quote that Orwell includes, where he says, political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. I think this ties in really nicely to what we've been talking about so far this semester, and it's a great segue into what you will be studying with your conspiracy theory final papers in this class. And so you always want to be on the lookout for where you see this political language being used. Are there words being used that obscure the meaning? As well as in your own writing when you're talking about it. How can you most clearly convey your meaning while maintaining that level of sophistication?